The night was thick with secrets, and Agatha Marple could almost taste the tension in the air as she stepped into the quiet of Maple Street. Beneath the calm, beneath the polished facades of the homes and the whisper of the trees, something dark had been set in motion. In the heart of the village, a life had been shattered, a lie carefully spun, and a man, once trusted, now hunted, was about to face the consequences of his choices. But as the truth clawed its way to the surface, one question remained: who would pay the ultimate price for the sins of the past? On the southern edge of the quiet village, where golden fields rippled under the sun and met a narrow winding lane, flanked by wild flowers swaying like whispers, lay a forgotten airfield, little more than a grassy strip outlined by weather-worn wooden posts. Though modest and often overlooked, it held a peculiar charm, enough to draw wanderers and watchers with a taste for the unknown. It was early afternoon when Detective Agatha Marple, clad in her signature tweed jacket and practical shoes, arrived with a simple plan in mind: to sketch the dilapidated barn that loomed near the edge of the airstrip, its aged wood sagging under years of wind and memory. But fate, as always, had other intentions. The sky was a pristine blue, the sun casting long shadows and the breeze whispering secrets through the tall grass, when Agatha's eyes were pulled upward by the collective gaze of a small group of villagers gathered near the hangar. A silver biplane was slicing gracefully through the air, its wings catching the sunlight in dazzling flashes. With a smooth dive, it landed on the strip, its wheels bouncing before settling as the engine purred, then sputtered into silence. From the cockpit descended a man with effortless flair, Larry Stokes, a name soaked in rumor and charm, a pilot known for reckless adventures and irresistible charisma that clung to him like the scent of danger. Agatha watched him closely, noting how he carried himself like he belonged more to the sky than the ground beneath him, his smile charming yet calculated. But it was not just Larry who drew attention. Standing slightly apart was Rose Whitlock, widow of the late Henry Whitlock, her presence quiet but piercing. She wore a cream summer dress and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face from the sun, but not from suspicion. Her grip on her handbag was just a shade too tight, her posture just a breath too rigid, as if she were bracing herself for something only she knew was coming. Agatha, ever the observer, caught the invisible threads of tension strung between the two. Larry saw Rose, smiled faintly, but didn't approach her, choosing instead to mingle with the crowd, though his eyes scanned each face like he was searching for a ghost. Then came Albert Wingfield, the portly and affable manager of the airfield, gesturing animatedly as he led Larry's attention to another aircraft being prepped at the far end. Agatha couldn't hear the words, but Wingfield's face was a portrait of conflicting emotions, excitement edged with something darker. The air buzzed with mundane sounds, the chirping of a skylark, the hum of distant engines, idle chatter, but beneath it all, Agatha felt it, that subtle, unshakable current of unease. Something unspoken lingered in the space between gestures and glances. Then a new figure emerged, a stout man in a rumpled tweed coat, walking briskly from a nearby shed, his expression caught somewhere between irritation and dread. In his hand was a metallic briefcase, clutched with the kind of grip reserved for things of immense value or immense danger. Agatha's sharp eyes followed him as he made his way to Larry, who now leaned casually against the plane's fuselage. The briefcase was thrust into Larry's hands with urgency, and though the exchange was quiet, the language of their bodies was thunderous. Larry's easygoing demeanor cracked for a moment, revealing a glimpse of unease, even defiance. The stout man's gestures were sharp, frantic, driven by something that looked a lot like fear. After a brief pause, Larry snatched the briefcase and shoved it into the cargo hold of the plane, his movements sharp, uncharacteristic. The stout man turned and walked away without another word, but the tension he left behind was thick enough to taste. Agatha narrowed her eyes beneath the brim of her hat, her pencil frozen above the page of her untouched notebook. knowing without a doubt that something more than flight paths and afternoon air shows was unfolding before her, something hidden, pulsing just beneath the surface, ready to break through with the next subtle crack in the facade. The late afternoon sun spilled golden light across the rural airfield, painting long spindly shadows that danced along the grass like silent spectators to a performance that had already begun. A soft breeze whispered through the hedgerows, carrying with it the faint scent of aviation fuel, and something far older, an unease that clung to the edges of things like dew. Agatha Marple stood poised at the edge of the gravel path, her gloved hand resting delicately on the handle of her parasol, her posture that of perfect stillness, but her eyes missed nothing. Larry Stokes, the ever-charismatic pilot, with a reputation for daredevil theatrics, glanced around nervously, the flick of his eyes betraying a restless paranoia, as though he feared someone had seen more than they were supposed to. Agatha remained unmoved, watching him without appearing to do so, noting the exact moment his swagger faltered. A few paces away, Albert Wingfield, the affable owner of the airfield, whose booming laugh usually carried across the tarmac like clockwork, approached Larry with a smile that felt strangely hollow today. His shoulders were set stiffly, and though his voice retained its usual warmth, there was a crack in its surface, a tremor he couldn't quite disguise. When Larry gestured subtly toward the plane, and the freshly loaded briefcase stowed in its hold, Albert's jovial mask slipped ever so briefly, just a flicker of unease, a pause too long, a smile too tight, but Agatha caught it like a spider, feeling the tremble of a distant thread. Her cousin, sturdy and even-tempered, was not a man easily unsettled, yet something about that case, or more likely the mysterious stranger who had brought it earlier, had disrupted his composure. Within minutes, the fueling was complete, and the engine coughed into life, its mechanical growl slicing through the warm stillness. Larry climbed into the cockpit, with his usual flair, waving at the thinning crowd with performative ease. Villagers, having had their moment of spectacle, began drifting away, their voices low, carrying fragments of idle gossip and lingering curiosity. But Agatha did not move. Her gaze remained fixed on Larry as he adjusted his dials, then scanned the field one last time. For the briefest moment, his eyes found Rose Whitlock standing by the edge of the gate, in a pale linen dress that fluttered like a ghost against the breeze. Their eyes met, and held. It was a glance neither casual nor accidental, loaded with some unspoken weight. Rose's face, normally so composed, turned ever so slightly, and she dropped her gaze, clutching her handbag with white-knuckled tension, as though trying to suppress a truth that had threatened to spill. The moment passed like a shadow over water, fleeting and nearly invisible, but not to Agatha, who, beneath the guise of fussing with the pleats of her skirt, had absorbed every nuance. With a rumble, the plane lifted from the grass, climbing sharply into the sky and banking eastward, disappearing beyond the tree line. The airfield fell silent once more, the sound of the engine fading until even the birds dared sing again. Agatha exhaled slowly and adjusted her gloves, but her thoughts spun like wheels caught in gravel. No one had said anything overtly suspicious. No direct accusations hung in the air. And yet, there was something, a fracture in the day's rhythm, a sour note in what should have been an ordinary afternoon. That sense stayed with her into the evening, when she sat in her cousin's modest sitting room, a space filled with the comforting clutter of mismatched furniture, and the faint aroma of tobacco and old wood. The sunset painted lace patterns through the curtains, and Agatha stirred a spoonful of honey into her tea, while Albert launched into a familiar ramble about the airfield's upcoming renovations. The world outside felt quiet, deceptively so, but that fragile quiet was shattered by a sudden, urgent knock at the door. Albert frowned, setting his pipe aside and rising to answer. Agatha paused mid-sip, her senses alert. From the threshold came the hurried murmur of a man's voice, frantic, breathless and low. Then Albert stepped back into the room, his ruddy complexion drained to a pallid hue. "There's been a crash," he said, his voice thin and stunned. "Stokes' plane just passed the fields." Agatha set her teacup down with careful precision. "Alive?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already sensed the answer. "Yes, alive," Albert replied, already moving toward his coat hook, badly shaken. "They've sent for help, but we'd best go." And as they stepped out into the cool evening air, the delicate threads of Agatha's suspicions began weaving themselves into something darker, something that hinted the events of the day were only the prologue to a far deeper mystery yet to unfold. The walk to the crash site, though only a few short minutes through the thinning paths behind the hedgerows, stretched like a silent procession under the weight of unspoken tension, each step muffled by the damp earth, and Albert's sudden unnatural quiet, casting a heavy pall over the amber hues of the descending sun. Agatha, ever perceptive, watched the way his broad shoulders seemed to collapse inward, his hands fumbling restlessly in his coat pockets, an unconscious betrayal of the storm gathering inside him. When they arrived, the field was already in disarray, the wreckage of the small aircraft etched into the soft soil like a wound freshly torn open, a loose ring of villagers holding their breath as they murmured in hushed clusters. Two constables in crisp navy uniforms moved briskly around the scene, their movements precise yet restrained, as if wary of disturbing something fragile beneath the surface. The plane itself was a contorted mess, nose down in the dirt, its propeller curled grotesquely like a snapped ribbon, and one wing crushed against a gnarled fence post, half swallowed by the field's sloping edge. Larry Stokes, the golden boy of local aviation, sat dazed nearby, a hand pressed to his temple, his flight jacket streaked with soil and his legendary swagger reduced to a vacant glassy stare. Albert moved quickly toward the officers, his voice low and clipped as he began a tense conversation, while Agatha, keeping to the periphery, studied the scene with an almost surgical focus. Her eyes scanned the twisted fuselage, the disturbed grass where panicked feet had gathered, the few strewn belongings half buried in the soil, yet what should have stood out most of all was missing, the metallic briefcase. The one loaded with such ceremony that very morning. Gone. Its absence was loud, even in this chaos. Drawing a few steps back, Agatha let the crowd's whispers wash over her like fog. "Always showboating, that one," a grey-bearded farmer muttered, bound to push his luck one day. Another voice, a woman's, cracked through the quiet like brittle glass, but no warning, no sputtering engine, just straight down like a stone. A younger man, flower on his apron, added, "Saw that Milligan fella marching off toward the station right after. Didn't even glance back. Bit odd, don't you think?" Agatha said nothing, but every word coiled around her instincts, confirming a familiar itch behind her composed expression. Her gaze shifted back to Larry, who now leaned against the side of a constable's motorcar, speaking to an officer with clipped, overly careful tones. His eyes flicked toward the wreckage, again and again, as if expecting something or someone to emerge. Not shaken, no. He was afraid, truly afraid. His posture screamed of a man cornered, not merely recovering. As the light began to soften into dusk, Agatha approached with deliberate grace, allowing the officer to finish before stepping in, her manner warm but precise. "Mr. Stokes," she began, her voice light but edged with intent, "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Miss Marple, Agatha Marple." Larry gave a slight nod, his gaze barely holding hers. "Miss Marple," he repeated, monotone, as if mouthing a name he already wished forgotten. "A pleasure, I'm sure." "You're fortunate," she said, her tone faintly ironic. "Could have ended much worse. Though I imagine your aircraft would disagree." Larry let out a dry breath, a poor attempt at a laugh. "No idea what went wrong," he muttered, glancing over her shoulder yet again, his eyes restless. But Agatha wasn't fooled. She could already see the seams unraveling around this man, seams stitched together not by mechanical failure, but by fear, guilt, and a secret he was desperately trying to keep buried beneath the wreckage. Larry's gaze remained fixed on the far edge of the field, as though searching for answers among the swaying grasses, the engine's sudden failure still reverberating in his mind. "Just stopped, I suppose," he muttered, his voice strained but strangely empty, as if he himself didn't fully believe the words. Agatha tilted her head slightly, her sharp eyes catching every subtle shift in his posture. "An unusual thing for an experienced pilot not to notice," she remarked quietly, her voice a careful mix of curiosity and observation. "No warning, no strange noises, just nothing." Larry's eyes flickered briefly, before he nodded, his words coming quickly, as though trying to push the explanation out as fast as possible. "Just happened." Behind them, Albert Wingfield, ever the one to fill any silence with his heavy presence, stepped forward with a show of exaggerated vigor, clearing his throat with a theatrical cough. "I'd say you're lucky to be standing here at all, Larry," he said with forced cheer, but his jovial tone faltered under the weight of the moment. "Planes are temperamental things after all." Agatha's gaze shifted to her cousin, noting the faint sheen of perspiration that glistened on his forehead, despite the cool evening air, the way his usual unflappable composure seemed to fray at the edges. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied evenly, though her voice held a subtle edge, as if the situation demanded more than just polite reassurances. "Though it's not every day one sees a plane simply drop out of the sky." Albert shifted awkwardly on his feet, his eyes darting around the wreckage as though seeking an excuse to move away from the conversation. He cleared his throat again, this time with more purpose. "Well, I suppose it's best to leave it to the authorities to sort out," he said, his tone now clipped, betraying his unease. "No sense in speculating just yet." Then with an abrupt change of subject, he asked, "And the package, Agatha, was that retrieved from the wreckage?" There it was. A momentary hesitation. Albert's face froze, the briefest flicker of panic crossing his features before he plastered a tight, mechanical smile onto his face. "I'm sure it'll turn up," he said, his words stiff, his eyes carefully avoiding hers. "Not worth troubling ourselves over now." Agatha studied him for a beat longer, sensing the lie hanging in the air like a sour aftertaste. Her instinct screamed that there was more to this than met the eye, but for now she let it slide, turning her attention back to Larry, who had taken a step away, his body turned toward the field, as though he yearned to disappear into the creeping shadows of the twilight. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes briefly meeting hers before quickly darting away again. The fleeting contact was telling. The expression on his face wasn't one of a man disoriented by a freak accident, but of someone who had seen and understood far more than they cared to admit. Agatha felt a stir of intrigue, a pulse of suspicion that deepened the silence between them. "Interesting," she thought to herself, her lips pressing into a thin contemplative line. "With that," she said, her goodbyes and turned to leave, her footsteps light on the soft earth as she made her way back toward the village. The path home was familiar, the cool evening air meant to refresh, but her mind was far from at ease. The briefcase's absence, Larry's strange behavior, Albert's odd diversion, it didn't add up. But something about it gnawed at her, a puzzle just out of reach. The trick, she knew, was to let the pieces settle before attempting to make them fit. As she quickened her step, the soft glow of the street lamp ahead beckoned her back to the warmth of home, but the questions still clung to her like the fading light. The following morning, the crash at the airfield had already taken on a life of its own. Quiet murmurs of speculation buzzed through breakfast tables, and the post office saw an influx of letters, each recounting the drama with varying degrees of sensationalism. Yet it was the lack of an official explanation and the conspicuous silence of certain key individuals that stirred Agatha's curiosity even more. Determined to dig deeper, under the guise of friendly concern, she made her way to the Railway Arms, the small inn on the village's outskirts, where Larry had taken refuge. The building's peeling green shutters and slightly crooked sign lent it an air of quiet mystery, an impression that deepened when Mrs. Carter, the landlady, ushered her into the dining room. Larry was seated at a corner table, his gaze distant as he stirred a cup of coffee. He looked up as Agatha approached, managing a faint, almost strained smile. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice flat, his posture stiff as he rose slightly to greet her. "I wasn't expecting company so early." Agatha offered a smile of her own, not overly warm but perfectly polite. "Good morning, Mr. Stokes. I hope I'm not intruding," she replied, her tone light and conversational. "I thought I'd call in to see how you were. Yesterday's events must have been quite the shock." Larry hesitated for a moment, his gaze momentarily flickering toward the window as though searching for an escape in the view beyond. He nodded slowly. "I'm fine, all things considered," he said, his voice betraying only a hint of strain. "Just shaken up." Agatha sat primly opposite him, smoothing the fabric of her skirt with a practiced hand. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, her voice holding a touch of empathy. "Crashes are terribly unpleasant, even when one escapes without a scratch." Larry's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a brief second, Agatha caught the faintest tightening around his jaw. "Yes," he said, his voice tighter now. "I suppose I was lucky." Agatha leaned forward just slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I dare say it wasn't entirely luck," she said softly, her words carrying a weight that seemed to hang between them. As Agatha sipped the steaming cup of tea that Mrs. Carter had carefully placed before her, she observed Larry's demeanor with quiet intensity. He was a man well versed in the art of concealing his unease, yet his slight tension betrayed the weight of the previous day's incident. His gaze was distant, his fingers lightly tracing the rim of his cup, as if trying to anchor himself to the present moment. Agatha placed her cup back on the saucer, her fingers brushing against the fine porcelain with deliberate slowness. "You must have known something was wrong before you took off, Mr. Stokes," she said, her voice steady but piercing. "A seasoned pilot like you, surely you noticed a strange hum, or a vibration in the engine." Larry's expression faltered, but only for an instant before his steely facade returned. "No," he replied, curtly, his voice thick with discomfort. "Everything was fine, just one of those things, I suppose." Agatha leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing ever so subtly. "And yet I couldn't help but notice your conversation with Mr. Milligan before the flight. Something about the briefcase, care to explain?" The air around them thickened, a charged silence filling the space between them. Larry's grip tightened on his coffee cup, his knuckles turning white, before he quickly muttered, "The crash was mechanical, nothing more." Agatha allowed a beat of silence to pass, letting her question hang in the air. She watched him carefully, noting the slight tremor in his hand as he set the cup down. "I see," she said, her voice laced with an almost imperceptible smile. "Well, I won't trouble you further, Mr. Stokes, but it is curious, isn't it?" Rising gracefully, she made her way to the door, her every movement a picture of composed serenity, but her mind was far from at ease. There was more to this story, she was certain of it. Larry's evasive responses only deepened her suspicions. The crash might have been mechanical, but the briefcase, its sudden disappearance, his frantic avoidance of it, spoke of something far more complex, something he wasn't ready to confront. As she stepped outside into the soft light of the morning, she glanced back over her shoulder. She could feel his eyes lingering on her, as though he was silently willing her to stay away. But Agatha Marple was not easily deterred. By the time she reached the cobbled path, leading to her home, her thoughts were racing, weaving together the threads of uncertainty. There was no telling what had truly happened at the airfield, but one thing was clear, the pieces of this puzzle were far from where they seemed to fit. With her gloved hands delicately folding in her lap, Agatha watched Larry carefully, noting every subtle movement, every slight twitch in his demeanor. His gaze, though fixed, seemed far away, and the silence between them stretched out, laden with unspoken words. Larry reached for the sugar bowl, his fingers almost trembling as he scooped a spoonful of sugar into his coffee, the clink of the spoon against porcelain resonating through the room. The air between them felt thick with tension, as if something was building just beneath the surface, something he was desperately trying to keep hidden. Agatha waited, her expression neutral, but her mind working overtime, passing every flicker of emotion she could catch in his eyes. She allowed the silence to linger a moment longer before finally breaking it, her voice cutting through the quiet like a gentle but insistent current. "Thank you for the chat, Mr. Stokes," she said, her tone pleasant but laced with an underlying sharpness. "I'm glad to see you're recovering." As she rose to her feet, collecting her gloves with graceful deliberation, she felt the weight of his eyes following her. The faintest hint of a smile tugged at her lips as she turned to leave, a smile that was more of a quiet triumph than a courtesy. She had gathered the pieces, his evasiveness, the trembling hand, the quick denial, and now she knew. The briefcase wasn't just missing, it was being concealed, hidden, and Larry Stokes was at the heart of it all, trying his best to keep something from reaching the light of day. As Agatha stepped into the warm sunlight outside, the quiet of Maple Street enveloped her. The cobblestones gleamed softly under the fading light, polished and glistening like a canvas freshly painted. The stately Georgian houses stood like silent witnesses to the unfolding drama, their facades untouched by time. A sense of serenity hung in the air, broken only by the faint sounds from the garden at number 17, where a garden party was underway. Agatha moved toward the wrought-iron gate, her footsteps muted against the gravel path. The scene before her was picturesque. Neatly arranged tables laden with delicacies, a fine silver tea service gleaming in the sun, and women in pastel frocks, their laughter mingling with the soft clink of porcelain. Lavender and roses lined the edges of the garden, their fragrance heavy and sweet, mingling with the more delicate scent of freshly brewed Earl Grey tea. Yet beneath the outward charm of the gathering, Agatha could sense the undercurrent of tension that pulled at the edges of the scene. Her sharp eyes quickly found Rose Whitlock, standing apart from the guests, a glass of lemonade in her hand. Rose was the epitome of elegance, her pale pink dress flowing like a soft wave of silk, her dark hair pinned with pearls, but there was something off, something brittle in her posture, in the smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Miss Marple," Rose's voice drifted across the garden, light but strained, like a bell ringing under pressure. "What a surprise. I hadn't expected to see you today." Agatha smiled, her expression warm but probing, as she approached. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice soft yet carrying an edge. "I was passing by and thought I might pay you a visit." Rose's smile sharpened, a thin veneer of politeness that barely concealed the discomfort she felt. "Not at all," she replied smoothly, though there was a tightness in her words. "Though I must admit I haven't much time to spare. I'm playing hostess, as you see." Agatha glanced over the guests, her eyes flicking from one carefully curated acquaintance to the next, noting the subtle tension in their movements, the way they clustered together in tight groups, as if avoiding scrutiny. "Quite the lovely gathering," she commented, her tone polite but sharp with observation. "Impressive that you managed to arrange this all on such short notice." Rose's laughter was light, but there was something hollow about it, something that didn't quite match the charm of her smile. "Oh, I've always enjoyed entertaining," she said, though the words felt rehearsed. "It's a pleasant distraction." Agatha's lips curled into a faint smile, a knowing look in her eyes. "Distractions can be quite useful," she said softly, her voice a delicate thread that tugged at something unspoken, especially after all that excitement yesterday. "I trust you've recovered from the ordeal." Rose's brow twitched just the slightest, the mask of composure cracking for an instant. "The ordeal," Rose repeated, her tone cool but edged with something sharp, as though the word itself was foreign to her. "Yes, the crash," Agatha clarified, her voice gentle but insistent. "A frightening thing, and so close to the village too." Rose's smile faltered, and Agatha could feel it, the shift in the air, the slight tremor in the hostess's composure. It was a brief moment, a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "See," The tension was thickening, coiling around them both like a tightening noose, and Agatha knew without a doubt that there was more to this party, to this crash, than either of them were letting on. Thought perhaps you might have been unsettled by it. Rose's hand waved dismissively, but her voice had a slightly brittle edge to it. Oh, Larry and his stunts, she continued with forced nonchalance. He always has a knack for theatrics. Agatha didn't respond immediately, instead letting the words hang in the air as she tilted her head, studying Rose with quiet intensity. Indeed, she said after a beat, her voice lighter than it had been before, but still it must have been rather alarming considering your history. She let the words settle, her gaze never leaving Rose's face, watching for the slightest shift in her expression. At the mention of history, Rose's smile faltered, the tightness around her mouth becoming more pronounced. Our history, Rose repeated, her voice cold but with a crack in it, as if the mention of their past had unearthed something she'd rather not revisit. You and Mr. Stokes, Agatha said lightly, her words slipping out like a gentle probe, pushing just a little further. Rose's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. That time, she said sharply, cutting Agatha off, is long past. Her voice was firm, final, but beneath the hard edges, Agatha could sense something deeper, a sharp hidden pain, an echo of something unresolved. I have no interest in Larry Stokes, Rose added, her tone closing the conversation with a cold finality. Agatha, ever the perceptive observer, knew better than to press the matter further. Instead she let the moment pass, giving Rose the space she craved. Well, Agatha said with a faint smile, I imagine you must be relieved to have moved on. Rose's response was short, clipped, and without further ceremony, her attention shifted to a nearby guest, asking about the tea. Agatha stepped back, allowing the conversation to swirl around her, her eyes never ceasing their quiet observation. The party continued with its curated charm, the guests engaged in polite chatter, while Agatha took in every detail, the stilted movements of Rose, the strained smiles that never quite reached her eyes, the way the conversation felt like a delicate veneer over something far more fragile. As she reached for a cucumber sandwich from the buffet, her ears caught a snippet of a conversation that made her pause. One of Rose's guests, a younger woman in a lemon-yellow dress, was speaking in low tones to her companion. Did you hear what happened at the inn the other night? She asked, her voice full of intrigue. Rose and that pilot, what's his name, had quite the row. Everyone in the lounge heard it. The companion raised an eyebrow. Larry Stokes, he asked. The woman nodded, her voice dropping even lower. Something about money, I think. It was quite the scene. Agatha's hand stilled, her fingers resting lightly on the plate. She didn't react outwardly, but inside, the pieces began to click together, fitting neatly into place like a puzzle, slowly revealing its image. She tucked the information away for later, her mind already turning over the implications. For now she remained unassuming, watchful and patient. The truth, as always, would reveal itself in time. The early morning light cast long shadows across the wreckage site, the faint, almost reverent quality of the scene, giving the charred remains of the biplane an eerie, still presence. The twisted metal and broken wings were a testament to the crash, yet Agatha's eyes were not drawn to the obvious destruction. Instead they moved methodically over the scene, noting the details that others might have missed. The engine lay twisted and blackened, a wing crumpled like discarded paper, and the cockpit, a ruin of shattered glass and bent controls. But there at the edge of the field was something more telling, faint impressions in the dirt, marks that suggested something heavy had been dragged away from the wreckage. She crouched, her gloved hand brushing gently over the disturbed earth, her mind already piecing together the scenario. The marks led away from the wreckage, disappearing into the tree line. Standing up, she smoothed the front of her skirt and glanced toward the constable, who was distracted, engrossed in a cigarette. Satisfied that she would not be interrupted, Agatha followed the trail. It wasn't long before she found something out of place, something that shouldn't have been there. Among the underbrush, caught in the roots of an old oak tree, was a single leather glove. Agatha bent to pick it up, turning it over in her hands, her brow furrowing. The glove was worn but still supple, and there was a faint trace of oil stained into the palm. She'd seen this glove before, just the day before when Milligan had handed her the metallic case. The sudden appearance of the glove here far from the crash site was telling. Someone had been here, someone had come for the case, and they'd been trying to cover their tracks. The pieces were falling into place. Someone had hidden the case, and it was no accident. Agatha stood up, her thoughts already racing ahead, a quiet sense of certainty settling over her. The game had changed and the truth was inching ever closer to the surface. The case had vanished before the authorities had even arrived, and while the case itself remained elusive, the glove was a breadcrumb leading deeper into the woods. Agatha stood still for a moment, her eyes lingering on the worn leather, before carefully slipping it into her handbag. A faint smile played at the corners of her lips as she straightened her hat, the satisfaction of discovery warming her chest. The wreckage, with its twisted metal and broken glass, had provided no easy answers, but this one clue, a hastily abandoned glove, had changed everything. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure the case was removed, and in their haste they'd left behind a trail that had not been properly covered. This oversight was telling. Agatha turned away from the crash site, her mind already racing ahead, plotting her next steps. Her reputation for unearthing buried truths often began in the most unassuming of places, like the village shop, a modest weathered storefront with a counter polished smooth by decades of elbows, leaning in to catch the latest gossip. It was here, amidst the warm scent of freshly baked bread and the sharp tang of paraffin, that Agatha first learned of Milligan's odd habits. Mrs. Sedgwick, the shopkeeper, was a woman of few airs but many words, especially when it came to dispensing gossip. As Agatha paid for her tea leaves, Mrs. Sedgwick leaned in, lowering her voice. "That Milligan fellow, odd sort, wasn't he? Always slipping in here with those big envelopes, whispering with Mr. Winfield as if they had secrets worth keeping." Agatha's interest piqued. She leaned in slightly, her expression neutral, but her mind already turning. "Envelopes, you say?" she asked, her tone light, though her thoughts were sharp. Mrs. Sedgwick, adjusting her apron, continued without hesitation, "Oh yes. He came by quite regularly before the crash, but then, just vanished. Didn't even stop by for his usual tobacco." Agatha, her mind whirling with the implications, tucked her parcel into her bag, murmuring, "Curious," as she moved toward the door. Later that day, Agatha made her way to her cousin Albert Wingfield's office at the airfield. The small, cluttered room, filled with maps and scattered papers, reflected Albert's tendency to bury himself in his work. His desk, large and worn, was a testament to a man accustomed to making decisions that could shape the course of events. Albert greeted her warmly, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor when she mentioned Milligan. His hands fumbled with a pile of documents, betraying a nervous energy he couldn't quite hide. "Milligan, I'm not sure what you mean," he said too quickly, his eyes darting to a stack of invoices as if they held the answers. Agatha, ever composed, pressed on lightly. "You remember him, don't you? A stout fellow, always carrying envelopes. Mrs. Sedgwick tells me he visited quite often." Albert hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. "I suppose yes, he did come by, on occasion. Nothing unusual though." Agatha's gaze sharpened. "Oh, I think it might have been a little unusual," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "What was he delivering?" Albert's forced chuckle didn't mask the discomfort in his eyes. "Just a few odds and ends. Papers for the airfield, nothing more." Agatha's smile never wavered as she replied, "Indeed, but it seems odd that he would leave so suddenly after the crash." Albert's face paled, and for a moment, he was speechless. "I don't know what you're suggesting, Agatha," he said, his voice tight. "Milligan wasn't involved in anything untoward." Agatha tilted her head, her gaze never leaving his. "He was a courier though, wasn't he?" she asked, her tone as gentle as a caress. Albert's hands trembled as he shuffled papers, his composure slipping. If you must know, yes, he said reluctantly. He brought sensitive materials, things that had to be handled discreetly. I agreed to store them temporarily, that's all. Agatha allowed the silence to hang between them for a moment, watching him closely. Quite a responsibility, she said, her words heavy with unspoken meaning. Albert, unable to meet her eyes, busied himself with papers that seemed suddenly less pressing. As he excused himself, mumbling something about needing to tend to an urgent matter, Agatha's mind continued to race. She had glimpsed a crack in his carefully crafted facade, and the weight of his evasion spoke volumes. Something about Milligan, and Albert's involvement, was not as innocent as it appeared. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and Agatha could sense that the heart of the mystery was closer than ever. As Agatha paused to observe the fuel delivery, her curiosity led her toward the desk, her eyes keen to understand every detail. There was nothing out of place in her observation. After all, she wasn't one to snoop for the sake of it. Yet something about the desk drew her in, specifically, a small drawer on the right-hand side, locked with a brass mechanism, that caught the gleam of the lamp's light. Agatha didn't make a move to open it, but the presence of that locked drawer seemed too deliberate to ignore. Why lock away papers in a desk that was otherwise cluttered and accessible? The question lingered in her mind. As Albert returned, his gaze immediately shifted to the desk, as though his earlier actions had left something incriminating in plain view. With a quick movement, he stepped in front of the desk, his hand resting protectively on its surface. Agatha, it's best if we leave this matter to the proper authorities, he suggested, his tone too rehearsed to be casual. Agatha gave him a faint disarming smile. Oh, of course, she said, her voice light. I wouldn't dream of interfering. But as she left his office and stepped into the cool afternoon air, her suspicions had only deepened. Albert's evasive responses, his nervous gestures, and the presence of that locked drawer pointed to something he desperately wanted to hide, and Agatha Marple was certain that people rarely went to such lengths for no reason at all. Maple Street lay quiet under the fading afternoon sun, its rows of Georgian townhouses appearing untouched by the mysteries swirling behind closed doors. Number 17, where Rose Whitlock resided, stood out only slightly. Its curtains were drawn just a touch tighter, the front steps swept with a touch more care than the others. Agatha, her thoughts now sharply focused, walked briskly down the cobbled road. She knew that her next visit would require a different approach. No more subtle probing, but something more direct. When Rose answered the door, her expression faltered just for a moment before she stepped aside to let Agatha in. This time there was no garden party to mask the atmosphere. The drawing room, though neatly arranged, felt heavy with unspoken tension. Rose gestured to a chair and poured tea, her movements automatic and stiff. When she finally sat across from Agatha, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the smile she offered was practiced, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Miss Marple, Rose said, her voice polite yet guarded. Back so soon. I do hope everything is all right. Agatha tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. I wanted to clarify a few things, she said, evenly, the crash at the airfield, the missing package, and your disagreement with Mr. Stokes the night before. Rose's hand trembled, just for a moment, the teacup clinking slightly as it threatened to spill. What disagreement? She asked, her voice betraying a hint of unease. Agatha's response was measured, unwavering. The one that occurred at the inn. Several people heard raised voices, yours and Larry's. Rose hesitated, her composure cracking under the weight of Agatha's words. She set the teacup down, the porcelain making a soft, almost final sound as it met the saucer. Yes, she admitted after a pause. Larry came to see me. He wanted money. Agatha's voice remained calm, even conversational. Money? She asked. Rose's jaw tightened. He threatened to reveal certain unsavory details about my late husband's business dealings, she confessed. I'm sure you've heard the rumors. Henry wasn't always the most scrupulous man. Larry wanted to use that against me. Agatha's gaze remained fixed on Rose, her voice unwavering as she pressed. "And you paid him?" Rose's bitterness seeped through her words. "Of course I did," she replied, her voice cold. "I didn't want my husband's memory dragged through the mud. Whatever Henry did is gone now. I didn't see the point in exposing it all just because of Larry's greed." Agatha's eyes narrowed slightly as she asked, her tone flat. "And you had no reason to harm Mr. Stokes?" Rose leaned back, a flush coloring her cheeks. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice firm. "I gave him what he wanted and sent him on his way. I thought that would be the end of it." For a long moment, Agatha said nothing. Her eyes drifted to the side table where a small brass clock ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound filling the silence. Every word, every gesture from Rose seemed to echo louder than the clock itself. There was something in Rose's story that didn't quite fit, something lingering in the spaces between the lines. Agatha's mind was already piecing it together. The clock ticked on, but in that stillness, the heart of the mystery began to reveal itself. Agatha sat back, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed Rose's stiffening posture, the subtle twitch of her fingers betraying the tight grip she had on her composure. "You mentioned paying him off," Agatha said softly, the words carefully measured as she allowed the silence to hang in the air between them. "But what about the package he was carrying that night? The one Milligan brought to the airfield, do you know what became of it?" Rose's expression froze instantly, her gaze darting away as her hands tightened around the armrests. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she replied, her voice tight, the words laced with an edge of defensiveness. Agatha's tone remained light, though there was a distinct sharpness to her words. "Really," she said, feigning casual curiosity. "It's curious, then, that a package so obviously important would simply vanish after Larry's crash, especially when you've gone to such lengths to protect your husband's legacy." Rose's eyes flickered toward the window, her lips pressing into a thin line, and for a fleeting moment, Agatha saw a flicker of doubt, a hesitation that threatened to break through her carefully maintained facade. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, she shook her head. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Miss Marple," Rose said softly, her voice almost pleading. "I've already told you, I paid him off, I didn't harm him, and I know nothing about a package." Agatha let out a soft, non-committal smile, her gaze unwavering as she reached for her gloves, her fingers slow and deliberate in their movements. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitlock," she said with the faintest hint of a smile, her voice cool and composed. "You've been most helpful." As Agatha made her way toward the door, she noticed Rose remained seated, her knuckles white against the chair. The tension in the room seemed to thicken, as Agatha stepped into the hallway, her mind turning over the inconsistencies in Rose's story. By the time she reached the street, the late afternoon sun had dipped lower, casting the familiar Maple Street in a warm golden hue. But the shadows at the edge of her thoughts grew darker, more insistent. Rose Whitlock knew more than she was letting on, and Agatha was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. The heavy oak door of Albert Wingfield's study clicked shut, muffling the noise of the bustling household beyond. Inside, the room felt warm, but the air carried a faint scent of pipe smoke and well-worn leather. A fire crackled in the hearth, yet the atmosphere remained far from comfortable. Seated around the room were three figures, each wearing masks of polite curiosity, but beneath their composed exteriors, tension coiled like a spring ready to snap. Agatha Marple sat poised at one end of the room, her posture impeccable, her composure unwavering. In her gloved hands, she held a small notebook, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. She glanced around at the gathered group, Larry Stokes, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat, Rose Whitlock, her usual elegance marred by an undercurrent of anxiety, and Albert, whose jovial demeanor seemed to be wearing thin. "Thank you all for coming," Agatha began, her voice calm yet firm, each word deliberate. "I thought it best we have a frank discussion, given the peculiar circumstances surrounding the crash. Albert chuckled uneasily, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. A frank discussion, is it? Well, let's hope it's not too grim. Agatha smiled faintly, her eyes cool. I do hope not, Albert. With that, she began to recount what she had observed, the suspicious deliveries from Milligan, the heavy metallic case that had disappeared after the crash, and the peculiar drag marks leading into the woods. She reminded them of Larry's evasive answers, the missing glove tied back to Milligan, and Rose's reluctance to address the argument with Larry the night before the incident. Taken individually, these may seem like minor coincidences, Agatha said, her voice steady, but together they tell a different story. The room fell into silence, save for the crackling fire. Larry shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the floor. Rose's hand tightened on the arm of her chair, her knuckles pale, and Albert's fingers stilled, his expression unreadable. I'll come to the heart of it, Agatha continued, her gaze unwavering. The crash was no accident, it was staged. Albert's eyes narrowed, his voice tight with disbelief. Staged? Agatha, surely you don't mean— I mean exactly that, Albert, Agatha replied, her tone even, her words slicing through the tension in the room. And the one who orchestrated it was you. Larry's eyes shot up, his breath catching as he caught Agatha's gaze, and Rose's lips parted in a faint gasp, her pulse quickening. Albert, flustered and reddening, tried to deflect, but Agatha's voice cut through the tension, each word deliberate, weighty. You had Milligan deliver those documents to the airfield, didn't you? The sensitive ones that tied you to a covert operation, papers that, if made public, could have torn down more than just your reputation. You knew the stakes, so you made sure they wouldn't reach their destination. She paused, watching his every move. The simplest way to do that was by arranging an accidental crash, an incident staged so perfectly that it would destroy the evidence beyond any hope of recovery. Albert's face flushed a deeper red, his protests weak against the storm building in the room. That's preposterous. His voice cracked, though the cold sweat beading on his forehead betrayed the lie. Why would I do something like that? Agatha's gaze flicked momentarily to Rose. It's simple, she said. You may have been able to keep it quiet if not for those around you. She turned her full attention to Rose, her words slicing the air like a knife. Mrs. Whitlock here didn't sabotage the plane, but she had every reason to want Larry discredited. She kept him distracted, ensuring that he flew at that specific time, his mind clouded, his temper heightened. The argument they had the night before wasn't just a coincidence, it was a calculated move, designed to keep him off balance, angry, and unable to question the oddities that might have crossed his path before takeoff. Rose stiffened, opening her mouth to defend herself, but no words came. Her hands trembled in her lap as the weight of Agatha's accusations sank in. Larry, eyes wide, shifted his gaze between Rose and Albert before settling on Agatha. His voice faltered. You both counted on my reputation for recklessness. You needed it to make the crash look like nothing more than a simple accident. Agatha's voice became sharper, her conviction unwavering. The truth always finds a way to rise to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. A long silence followed her words, a tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. The crackling of the fire in the hearth seemed louder now, echoing through the room, amplifying the oppressive stillness. Agatha folded her notebook with a crisp sound, placing it delicately on her lap before leaning forward, her voice soft but firm. Lies always leave traces, Albert. You can destroy the evidence, but you can't erase the footsteps leading to the fire. Larry sat motionless, confusion and disbelief etched across his face, while Rose's gaze dropped to her hands, the tremor in her fingers betraying her calm exterior. Albert slumped back in his chair, his bravado gone, his eyes locked on the floor, as if seeking solace in its emptiness. Agatha's expression softened for a moment, but her voice remained steady as she addressed Rose, smoothing her gloves and adjusting her hat. I trust we'll have no further accidents, Mrs. Whitlock." She stood and made her way toward the door, her movements poised, controlled. With a final measured glance back, she stepped into the cool night air, the door clicking shut behind her with finality. Outside, on Maple Street, the lamps flickered to life, casting long stretching shadows across the cobblestones. Agatha paused for a moment, inhaling the crisp night air, the scent of damp earth and distant trees mingling in the quiet. The mystery had unraveled, but deep within, she knew this was only the beginning. There were more secrets, more lies yet to be uncovered, and more truths waiting to emerge from the darkness. The great oak door swung closed behind her as she walked down the path, her mind already turning to what came next. The night held its secrets tightly, but Agatha Marple knew truth, no matter how elusive, would always find a way to reveal itself. The faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth lingered in the air, blending with the cool night breeze that now swept through Maple Street, where the customary stillness had returned, though it carried an undeniable air of unease. The drama within Albert Wingfield's study had come to an end, but the ripples of its consequences were just beginning to spread. At the far end of the street, Larry Stokes stood by the weathered gate of the railway arms, his usually confident posture now slumped, a small bag resting at his feet. He glanced up as Agatha approached, his voice low, almost a murmur. "Miss Marlowe," he began, his words weighed with the gravity of his resignation. "I reckon I won't be stayin' here much longer." Agatha gave him a measured look, her tone neutral but sharp as ever. "I gathered as much," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "What will you do now?" Larry shrugged, his movements slow, as if the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. "Start over, somewhere new I suppose, somewhere no one seems best for everyone." Agatha nodded, though she suspected that Larry had been bracing himself for some form of condemnation. Yet she offered none. She knew Larry wasn't a bad man, not truly. He had simply been caught in the tangled web of others' machinations, his fate swayed by forces beyond his control. Still she knew his departure would bring a certain relief to some, and a quiet disappointment to others. Maple Street had always been a place that clung to its secrets, but with Larry leaving, he was freeing himself from burdens that could have weighed him down further. Further up the road, the curtains at number 17 were drawn tightly, sealing Rose Whitlock behind the immaculate facade she had built for herself. Once a bright and shining fixture of the village, Rose had retreated, her social star dimmed by scandal. Agatha imagined her alone in her drawing room, nursing a glass of sherry, the flickering firelight casting shadows across the room. Rose's involvement in Albert's scheme had been more circumstantial than malicious, yet the stain of her choices would linger long after the whispers of scandal faded. Agatha doubted the garden parties that once filled her calendar would return any time soon. Scandal had a way of draining the sparkle from even the brightest of socialites. When Agatha reached the airfield, she found Albert waiting near the gate, his figure hunched slightly as if burdened by something unseen. His hands were buried deep in his coat pockets, his posture heavy, almost desperate, as though he were clinging to the last vestiges of the "Agatha," he began, his voice cracking with pleading emotion. "You must understand, I never meant for things to get so out of hand. I just wanted to protect the airfield. The village needs it. Needed it, the jobs, the visitors. I thought I was helping." Agatha regarded him with a cold, steady gaze. "Helping," she repeated, her voice calm but firm. "By staging an accident, by destroying documents that you feared might expose the truth." Albert's face was pale under the moonlight, and he seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his own words. "I didn't think it through," he admitted, his eyes searching hers desperately. "I acted out of fear, but it was for the greater good, I swear it." "The greater good?" Agatha echoed, her tone laced with quiet disbelief. She studied him for a long, tense moment, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. "That may be so, Albert," she said softly, her voice unreadable. "But it is not my place to decide that. There are authorities better suited to weigh your intentions against your actions. As the words hung in the air, Albert's shoulders slumped in defeat, the last remnants of his defiance crumbling before Agatha's steady resolve. The weight of the night, of the secrets exposed and the truths unearthed, pressed heavily upon them both. And though the mystery was unraveling, Agatha knew this was far from the end. There would always be more lies to uncover, more shadows to chase, and more truths that would emerge when the time was right. Albert's expression faltered as the weight of Agatha's words sank in. "You can't," he began, his voice trembling with a hint of desperation, but Agatha's response was calm, almost final. "Then I have to," she said simply, her tone unwavering. "The truth needs to come out, for the village's sake as much as anyone's." Albert dropped his gaze, his shoulders slumping under the invisible burden of guilt and regret. "I suppose that's fair," he murmured, the words barely escaping his lips, tinged with quiet sorrow. As Agatha turned to leave, there was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction in the victory that had been earned, only a solemn, unwavering resolve settled within her. She understood Albert's motivations, even sympathized with his fear of exposure, but she knew that sympathy did not equate to justice. And justice, as she had learned long ago, was never as simple as it seemed. By the time Agatha reached her own front door, the air had grown colder, biting and sharp, a reminder that the night was far from over. She paused on the front step, glancing back toward the now dimly lit Maple Street. The village had always appeared serene, almost idyllic, with its pristine homes and genteel residences, where everything seemed meticulously in place. But the events of the past few days had unraveled something far darker lurking beneath that polished surface. Greed, desperation, pride, these were not vices belonging to strangers. They lived here among friends and neighbors. They lingered in the shadows of every tightly drawn curtain, in every hurried glance exchanged across a crowded room. Agatha unlocked her door, and stepped into the warmth of her sitting room, but even as the comforting heat wrapped around her, her mind remained ensnared by the revelations of the evening. She sank into her armchair, a cup of tea in hand, the stillness of the room offering no solace from the questions that continued to swirl within her. A brief smile tugged at her lips, as she reflected on the complexity of human nature, how endlessly fascinating it was, so tangled, so contradictory. Justice, discretion, understanding, none of it was ever clear-cut, was it? Yet perhaps that was what made life so endlessly intriguing, the constant struggle to see through the web of lies, to untangle the threads, and if you were fortunate, to catch a glimpse of something resembling truth. As the clock struck 10, and the house settled into a deeper quiet, Agatha turned her attention to her knitting. The soft click of the needles was the only sound in the room, a gentle rhythm that accompanied her thoughts. For tonight, at least, this particular mystery had been solved, but she knew better than most that mysteries never truly ended. There were always more, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And Agatha, ever watchful, was ready to uncover whatever lay hidden next.